Hi, I'm Jill with West Regional Branch of the Mobile Public Library, and today I want to talk about yarn. The last thing you want to do when you pick up knit or crochet is go to the yarn aisle and see all the choices and pick up some stuff that's really pretty and then get it home and realize that you have absolutely nothing you can do with it. So in this video, I'm going to attempt to break down all the different things you need to know to be able to pick yarn for your first projects. Now, the first thing you need to know about picking yarn is that there is no standardization in how they name yarns. So different manufacturers will label them differently, which makes things a little bit confusing. While I was doing research for this video, I did find a fellow crafter who was good enough to make a spreadsheet that kind of laid out all the different common names and their sizes. So I will put the link to that in the description box. I thought that was very helpful. But let's just get into what do you need to know to pick up yarn. Now, one of the things I've said in previous videos is to read the yarn label. So we will start off with that and go through the various things you commonly see on yarn labels. I'm going to put some examples over here. The most important thing to look for on a yarn label is usually the yarn type. There are different kinds of yarn. Some common ones are a medium worsted, which is what this yarn is. Get that to focus on the yarn. But anyway, it's just your normal kind of twisted yarn. This one is a DK or light worsted, which is actually the same kind of yarn as this, except for it's just a little bit thinner. When you eyeball it, they look almost the same. It's only when you have them really close together that you realize that this one's just a little bit thinner than this one. You also have sport yarn, baby yarn. There's a bunch of different types. And that yarn type is what you're usually going to see in a pattern. So if you're reading a pattern up at the top somewhere, it's probably going to say use a medium worsted, or use a super bulky, or use a fingering, or something like that. And then you look for a yarn that has that same name on the label so that you know you're matching what that pattern says to use. And that is probably your most commonly used term to tell you what kind of yarn you want to use. And also, a lot of times in the name, it'll kind of give you an idea of what to use it for. For example, sock yarn, obviously, it's what you usually use to use socks. You can make a lot of different other things with it besides socks, but it does kind of give you a hint about what it's most commonly used for. The second thing you're going to see on yarn labels, and this is again not standardized, you'll see it on most yarn labels, but not every one of them, is going to be a little ball of yarn illustration with a number in it. That number gives you the weight of the yarn, which is really the thickness of the yarn. The smaller the number, the thinner the yarn. The bigger the number, the thicker the yarn. The range goes from 0 up to 7. And you're never going to, at least I have never seen a pattern that put a particular number on the pattern for what kind of material it calls for. But if you have two different yarns that are the same number, they're about the same thickness, and you may be able to substitute one for the other. So for example, if you bought a velvet yarn, which is a very specialty yarn, you're probably not going to find very many patterns that specifically call for velvet yarn, but it says it's a size 4. Well, medium worsted is also a size 4. So if you find a pattern for a medium worsted, you may be able to use that velvet yarn in the pattern. Another thing you will see on pretty much every yarn label is how much yarn is in the package. And sometimes it'll be there as grams, sometimes as yards, sometimes as both. And what you really need to focus on is the number of yards. So if your pattern says it needs 250 yards and then your yarn says it's got 100 yards per ball, you will need 3 balls to complete your project. So you want to make sure you get enough yarn of the same type to finish whatever you're making, because you don't want to get 3/4 of the way through, run out of yarn, and then you go back to the yarn store and they're out of that yarn, and then you're like, now what do I do? So always make sure you get enough yarn for the project. Most yarns will also have a color name and possibly a dye lot. That helps you make sure you get the same color if you're getting multiple balls for one project. That dye lot is, even if it's theoretically the same color name, if they are dyed in two different batches, sometimes you can get a slightly different color between the two batches. So if you need 4 balls, you probably want to check those labels. Make sure you get the same dye lot for all 4 if you can. Sometimes you can't, but do your best on that. Another thing you will see on pretty much every label is what is the yarn made of. If you go into one of your big box stores like Joann's or Michael's, almost everything there is going to be acrylic or at best an acrylic blend. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with working with acrylic. It is easy to find, easy to use, inexpensive, and it will work for a lot of projects. I do a lot of stuff in acrylic, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with using it. However, the material that you make your item out of is going to affect the final product. Wool socks are different than polyester socks. Wool socks are going to be way warmer than anything you make with an artificial fiber. Same thing as if you get a scratchy value saver acrylic and make a sweater out of it, that sweater is not going to be near as nice as if you made a cashmere sweater. But on the other hand, just because it's premium doesn't mean it's like the best one to use, because if you use, a really premium, fine spun yarn and make socks out of it, you may wear holes in those socks way too fast. So, you got to consider what are you making and what do you want out of it. So the material does make a difference. But like I said, there is absolutely nothing wrong with acrylic. Most yarns are also going to have washing instructions on them, and they use the same standard washing instructions icons that you see on garment labels. So I'll put a link to a chart that explains those in the description box. One thing to make sure when you're looking at those washing instructions is that you get yarn that is appropriate to what you're making. So, if you're making a baby blanket, you want to make sure that the yarn says it's machine washable, because you do not want a baby blanket that is dry clean only. So, make sure you get yarn with the appropriate washing instructions for whatever you're making. The last thing you'll usually see on a yarn label is icons that will suggest knitting needle or crochet hook size and how big a swatch may be if you use those size needles or hooks. You can't, if you're working from a pattern, usually just ignore that. You want to go by what the pattern says, not by what the yarn label says. But that information can be very handy if you are not working from a pattern, if you're just sort of like eyeballing it, you're making something simple like a scarf, and you're just doing like a square and you're not using a pattern. If that's the case, you may want to take that suggestion that's on the label to get the appropriately sized needle or hook, because it's not like a bad suggestion, it's just that you generally want to go with what the pattern says, because that's generally more important than what's on that label for the yarn. And that pretty much covers all the different things you will see on a yarn label. If I forget something, please leave me a comment and let me know what it is that you always look for on the yarn label that I forgot to mention. And now let's talk a little bit about patterns. Some patterns are just going to list a yarn type. Every pattern in this book just says DK or light worsted yarn. DK and light worsted are the same. Other patterns will tell you a very specific type of yarn. All of the patterns in this book specifically ask for Lily's Sugar and Cream yarn. It doesn't tell you what that kind of yarn that is, it just says that particular brand. Now for me, I did not have the Lily's Sugar and Cream, and I was not going to go and buy that yarn specifically to make these things. So what I did was I went online and looked up to see what type of yarn Lily's Sugar and Cream is. Ravelry has a great database that has pretty much any yarn you can think of listed in it. It gives you all the specs. Or you can just go to one of your stores, websites, and look it up and just read the product listing. But anyway, the Lily's is a medium worsted, so I knew if you can since it's a medium worsted, I could just substitute in any of the other medium worsteds I already happen to have that were different brands. While we're on the subject of substitutions, I will say you can almost always substitute two different brands of yarn as long as they are the same type, like two medium worsteds, two double knits, two sock yarns. Even if a pattern calls for one particular brand, you can grab something from another brand as long as it's the same type of yarn. That doesn't 100% all the time work, but mostly you're safe there. A lot of the time you can substitute two yarns that are different from each other, but as long as they're the same size. So if it's two size 4s, you can swap them out. Two size 6s, you can swap them out. If they're two different like textures of yarn, you have a little bit more likelihood that it's not going to work, but it works more often than not. Then if you're trying to go between sizes, that's a lot more hit and miss. That's really going to depend on what kind of project are you making and how much does size matter. So if it's something that's going to be fitted, you probably cannot swap between two different sizes of yarn. But if it's something more like what I generally make, which is like amigurumi, and I'm not that particular about what size it comes out, in that case, I don't typically have much problem, swapping between two sizes. But if you're doing anything fitted, it's probably not going to work. And then you also do have to consider what kind of material you're swapping out. So if a pattern calls for 100% cotton yarn, you may be able to swap in an acrylic, or it may not work because the durability or the breathability or something like that just makes the pattern not work with a different material. So there's a lot of trial and error with this. I would recommend sticking to what the pattern calls for until you've had more experience with different kinds of materials and seeing how different kinds of materials perform before you start trying to substitute. I mean, if you do like a strictly brand substitution, one brand for another, but they're both the same type of yarn, that's probably going to be fine. But anything more complicated than that, might get you into trouble until you get a good grasp on the different types of materials and how each material performs, so you know what the trade-offs are when you make those substitutions. Do a gauge swatch first anytime you're doing a large project, because even if you have the exact right materials, just how tight or loose you knit may put your gauge off. And if you're swapping any kind of material, that ups your chances that your gauge is going to be a little bit off. So do that swatch first, just to be on the safe side. And I will put a link in the information box about gauge swatching and how that works. If you're just starting out learning the basic stitches, you're not to the pattern stage yet, you're just doing little squares and scarves to practice, don't just go down the yarn aisle and pick out something pretty in the specialty yarn section, because you're likely just shooting yourself in the foot by trying to work with something that's tricky to work with. So start with just really basic, simple yarn. A good one to get is a medium worsted in a light color. I recommend the medium worsted because it's easy to find, it's easy to work with, and you're going to find a lot of beginner patterns to use it on once you move past the beginner stage. You may alternatively want to pick up something a little bit bigger, a bulky or a super bulky yarn. Stick with something that's that same sort of twisted weave as a medium worsted, because that twisted weave gives you that little bit of stretch that makes it easier to work with when you're trying to get your hook or your needles back through those loops. But it's also not too puffy, because if you get something too fluffy, it's hard to see your stitches. And like I said, light color, twisted, big enough to see and handle, those are the things you're looking for. If you get something like a lace yarn or a chenille or a velvet, it may not have the stretch you need, and it may be too fluffy. You may not be able to see your stitches, and also stay away from those dark colors because it makes it harder to see your stitches. And I'll also give you the tips, make sure you get something that's kind of soft and feels nice in your hands, because as you are knitting or crocheting, you are going to be handling that yarn a lot, especially in crochet where you actually have to weave it through your fingers. You don't want something rough that's going to dry your hands out. The last thing you need to know about buying yarn is that some yarn comes in balls and some yarn comes in hanks. And I'll put a picture of a hank up here so you know what I'm talking about. If it comes in a ball, just take the label off, find the end, start knitting. That is no problem, it's very simple. If it comes in a hank, you actually need to wind the hank into a ball before you use it. If you try to start just knitting off the hank, your yarn's going to get completely tangled and you're going to have to spend an enormous amount of time untangling it. Sometimes you just can't untangle it. It's like you've just got to cut it and start pulling it apart again. So you don't want to do that. What you're going to have to do is you untwist the hank, loop it around something, the back of a chair, whatever things you've got handy. I've used like a large canister, wrapped it around, and then you will have to ball it. You can ball it by hand, or you can use a ball winder and a Swift. If you do get really heavily into yarn crafting, you might want to pick one of those up. However, they do usually have them at yarn stores that sell hanks of yarn, so you can ball it before you leave the store. Now, if you're picking up something and you're not planning to use it immediately, you may want to leave it in the hank. This is not something I've had personal experience with because I don't typically buy things that I don't plan to use shortly, but if you leave the yarn in a hank, it's supposedly supposed to keep its shape and stay fluffier longer. So if you're picking up something you don't have immediate plans to use it and it may spend a couple of years in your stash, you may want to leave it in a hank and only ball it just before you're planning to use it. And then finally, on the subject of stashes, if you use part of a ball of yarn, make sure you hold on to the label, because otherwise what you will end up with is a bag full of partial balls of yarn that you've got to play guessing games with because you can't remember what it's made out of or what weight it is or how much you have left. So, hold on to those labels. You will appreciate having them later. And I think that's pretty much all the things I can remember to tell you about purchasing yarn, keeping yarn. So, if you've got any other tips or things that I missed, leave me a comment down below, and I hope to see you later. Bye-bye.